Hello! Some of you may remember my last video, where I talked to you about the Bentham Curve. Quite the deep cut in matters of transit, if I do say so myself. What? Today, however, the topic shall be the Leamside Line. Quite a different kettle of fish altogether. There's a good chance you've heard about the Leamside Line, even if you're not overly into transit and you're only watching this video out of pity. Hiya, ma'am.
The reopening of the Leamside Line is basically the local transit equivalent of one of the big three local football teams winning a non-pizza related trophy. It's always talked about as being just around the corner. Certain people get really overly excited about it, but it's just seemingly never to be. On second thoughts, that's not such a terrible analogy, is it? In both cases, it is a large infusion of cash that could really make a difference. Anyway, as I'm at risk of alienating half the region, let's drop the football talk. So we've got another day, another abandoned railway bridge. What a beauty. This here, lads and lasses, is the Victoria Viaduct. A glorious example of Victorian engineering. Far from any main roads, the Victoria Viaduct absolutely dominates the landscape, sitting high above the River Wear, between Washington and Penshaw. Basically 90% of the plans you see about reopening the Leamside Line and extending the Metro to Washington involve the Victoria Viaduct to some extent. It's absolutely caught the idea. But what if I were to tell you, there's another bridge that should be seen as just as key to any plans to reopen the Leamside Line? Unless you're massively into historic local railways, no Matt, doesn't mean you, then this bridge, the Belmont Viaduct, it's probably not something you've heard too much about. It's a real hidden treasure, totally inaccessible from any paved roads, 2 miles downriver from Durham city centre. Despite the regular pushes we've seen over the years to reopen the Leamside Line, this bridge and the branch it sits on, they just never seem to get a mention. Which strikes me as quite curious really. As for my analysis, this bridge could be simply transformative for Wearside. Rule number 1 in problem solving. You do not talk about problem solving. No, wait, that's wrong. Quite the opposite really. The first part of problem solving is that you talk a lot about problem solving. You don't jump straight to the solution. First you need to spend some time identifying and analysing what the problem even is. A typical analogy to demonstrate this is that nobody needs a 3-inch drill bit. What they actually need is a 3-inch hole. It could be that through studying this problem, you'll realise that the needs of this particular project aren't for a nice neat hole. It could be that rather than going out and spending your pennies on a fancy pants drill bit, just whacking a wall of hammer will do the trick. In my previous video about the Bentham Curve, I do think that what we had was definitely a problem first situation. Even in the darkest timeline, where trains are a thing that didn't exist, there's a big issue with access to Newcastle from the south. That unused freight line that shadows the East Coast Mainline for 3.5 miles, a perfect solution to this problem. All this Washington Metro and Leamside Line business then? Well, there's more chat about that than basically every other potential transport improvement in the area put together. But I find myself asking, with this one, are they putting the cart before the horse? Is there an actual real problem to be solved? Or is it just a case of, oh, we have this big unused rail line that runs through a few constituencies, so let's do something with it? Over the course of this video, that's the question I'm going to be chipping away at. I'll be looking at Washington's general situation, past proposals for a metro extension to Washington, the restoration of passenger service on the Leamside Line. Then ultimately I'm going to be getting on to the big question, whether reopening the Leamside Line is something that's actually going to happen and if it's even a worthwhile thing to be putting our limited resources into, or is there something we could be doing better to make it so? Are we all sitting comfortably? Well then, let's get cracking. Starting from the very basics then, just what is a Washington? As you'll probably know, though the internet is a font of knowledge for basically anything, when it comes to out local it can be a bit lacking. Just on the off chance though, let's quickly search and see if we can find some stock footage of Washington. It's been a while since I've been to Washington, but that's absolutely not how I remember it. I do think the internet might be playing tricks on us here, showing some other, some lesser, some dare I say it, fake Washington. I'm just kidding. I did do some research before writing this script. I can tell you that, fun fact, just like that imitation Newcastle down by Stoke, or that Falkland Stanley for when the post takes a scenic route, there are indeed a few Washingtons in the United States. Apparently there was like some guy who was like a descendant of the County Durham gentry like way back when. He ended up like becoming Shogun of America or something. And they like named lots of stuff after him, which like, you know, is pretty bloody rude to the real Washington. Really pushes them down the search results.
So proper Washington then, real Washington.
It's clear the internet's not going to be any help.
I'm going to have to put trousers on again, aren't I?
Now, this is more like it.
Here I am in the Washington that should be more familiar to you.
It's certainly how I've most commonly experienced Washington in my life.
Since 1974, Washington's officially been part of the city of Sunderland. It's one of the 10 biggest towns in the region, home to around 70,000 people. Began back to the early 60s and it was basically all fields around here. It was just a distant corner of County Durham, home to only around 20,000 people spread across 18 villages, including the historic original Washington and pit villages like Fatfield and Usworth Colliery. It was under Durham County Hall's watch that Washington was designated as a new town in 1964, with a plan to quadruple its population by the 1990s. What's a new town? Well, it's in the name, isn't it? New towns are towns. Towns that are new. New towns. Aye, okay. There's a bit more to it than that. Not just any modern development's a new town. The term new town has a special legal distinction. They were born out of the interwar construction boom in Britain. During this period, Britain's towns and cities sprawled out into the surrounding countryside. Many saw this as quite an undesirable thing, and after the brief nationalist spanking intermission that was the war, the Labour government that came to power set about radically altering Britain's planning system to stop this from ever happening again. This gave her the basis of the system that we have today, where urban expansion, or hell, basically any building, is severely restricted. For the British planning system, I'm not going to go there, I'm no law talker. In the British planning system, it's an absolutely mammoth subject, which properly covered would take a day-long video. As a topic, it absolutely drove the Leamside Line. Long story short though, it was originally set out by the Attlee government, it wasn't that bad. Yeah, someone just building a house somewhere was a proper Sisyphean level task, but this was planned for with the new towns. The basic idea was that rather than just having private developers building housing willy-nilly, a field here, a field there, you'd instead have specially designated areas, which were taken out of the control of local government, handed over to development corporations with the goal of greatly building up their population. This top-down building approach doesn't happen these days, of course. We haven't seen any new towns created since the start of the 70s. In the 21st century, things are in such a state that the government can't get anything built. But new towns are what the British planning system is fundamentally designed for. No doubt a key factor in our current mess. Anyway, so these new towns. They were to be properly planned from the ground up, distinct new communities built on greenfield land, where all the latest and greatest of mid-20th century planning knowledge could be applied to the max. These towns wouldn't just be distant overspill estates for the city's workers, but places in their own right, with all the shops and schools and community cohesion that involves. I know what you're thinking when it comes to 1960s architecture, but in Washington they decided to do something a bit different, seeking to incorporate and expand and revitalise the existing villages, rather than just wipe them out and start again with a clean state. Rather than packing the place with brutalist monoliths, Washington was designed to be built on a more human scale, where the highways that people would use to go about their business, providing a solid separation between the low-rise housing estates where they lived and the industrial estates where they worked. This was a town designed to prioritise people, not cars. Take a walk around Washington today, and there's parts of it which are downright lovely. Washington Village is pretty scenic. I mean, just look at that, Great Britain in Bloom Award. And then there's down by the river, which is, it's really canny. Even in Washington's less posh parts, you really don't get the impression that you're in a big town. It's all very leafy and quiet. Washington by design gives you a bit of the feeling of being out in the countryside, whilst keeping you just a short drive to all that the cities have to offer. For most of Washington, it's just a 20-minute to 30-minute drive into Sunderland or Newcastle or Durham, plus the extra half an hour to find a parking space, of course. And this is something that really appeals to a lot of people. I know a fair few living around Washington Way, and their moans about naff buses haven't been enough to make them move out. It's not for nothing that half of the Sunderland football team seem to have a Washington address. Some of the Sunderland Council area's snazziest postcodes ought to be found here. If you're to nitpick with a critical eye though, then right off you can see some possible housing issues. I know from experience that some of the design elements you see here, they really don't age well. Did I ever tell you about that time way back when I was a lad? Sitting in my bedroom at my parents' house, watching a film, and all of a sudden their 1960s built flat roof blew off. Anecdote aside, a lot of Washington's housing was built quickly and cheaply 60 years ago, and it will be hitting its end of life. There's a reason flat roofs aren't traditional in famously moist Britain. Who knows, maybe they've all had great maintenance work since they were built, and just walking the streets, even the rougher corners of Washington, they really don't look too bad at all. But looks can be deceptive. Looking at the data, you do see a lot of areas of high deprivation in areas like Concord. What's going on there? Getting to the fundamental question of why is poverty a thing? Well, that's another topic which absolutely dwarfs any chat about the Leamside Line. But I do think we can get to some explanations for local issues without too much bother, and identify in that some areas where Washington's planners really made a mess of things. Going back to the start, 1964.
Lots of men in terrible suits, packed into a smoke-filled room to set out a vision for the future. Where Washington, they didn't just want to build housing. Nah. They wanted to do a lot more than that. Even back then, you see, or hell, further back, say Team Valley, it was recognised that the northeast was in sharp decline and that the north-south divide was rapidly widening. Regions old primary employers such as coal, steel and shipbuilding, they were in a long drawn-out steady decline. These dirty industries were seen as the past. The third industrial revolution was starting up. The economy of the future would be based around manufacturing in nice, clean, high-tech factories. And this was a big part of Washington's conception. It would be a new modern centre for British manufacturing, forged in the white heat of technology. Sustainable socio-economic growth to revitalise the region was core to the thinking behind the town. Washington wouldn't just be home for 70,000-80,000 people, nah, it'd also be a major employment centre. Its industrial estates would provide enough work for all of its residents, and more besides. If you lived in Washington, you'd never have to leave a rough 1.5 mile radius around this new town centre. Washington would have everything you could ever need. It all seemed a perfectly sound decision by the government at the time. All the trends pointed that way. Workers would stroll out of their dark and nasty old jobs down the pit and right into work of better paying conditions in the shiny new factories. In Harold Wilson's words, replacing the cloth cap with the white laboratory coat as the symbol of British labour. In this era, massive efforts were made to transform the region. Washington wasn't the only place. Various other developments, large and small, were born out of this confidence in North East's manufacturing future. Kielder Reservoir, for instance. No expense was plenty of corners were cut, but progress was made. Aye, the 60s were a time of massive decline in traditional industries, but the way to the future seemed clear. It was a period of optimism, confidence was high. Just as trends began to turn, and in hindsight it became clear that manufacturing maybe wasn't the future of mass employment after all. They correctly predicted some bits of the technological revolution that was getting into gear, but completely failed to grasp how the rise in technology and automation would dramatically slash the workforce needed by factories. And do remember when you're looking at this graph that what we're seeing is national numbers, reality has an uneven spread. Factor in the rise of foreign competitors who did a much better job of keeping pace with modernity, and you can see some flaws in the conception of Washington. It isn't all doom and gloom, of course. The North East's economy to this day remains heavily based on manufacturing. Just because it isn't the mass employer it once was, doesn't mean it's not doing well. British industry is in a much better state than it was 50 years ago. And it's not like 15% of the workforce is anything to sniff at. One of the region's flagship businesses is squeezed between Washington and Sun and Popper. Nissan UK employs thousands of people. It seems like everyone between Ashton and Stockton knows someone who's worked at Nissan. Factoring in commuting flows, the outdated 1960s views on gender roles, and the disastrous change in cost of living over recent decades, and I guess you could argue that Washington does provide enough jobs for its projected population. But there is a big problem in all those non-Washingtonians coming in and stealing Washington jobs. Look after our own first, Washington jobs for Washington people. Nah, that'd be a ridiculous way to view the world. Who would ever think something like that? That's not how jobs work. If you want to hire, say, an electrician, then you're going to pick someone with relevant qualifications and experience who's alright with driving in for half an hour every day, rather than, say, a hairdresser whose only selling point is to happen to live 10 minutes walk away. Or, vice versa, of course. No slight on hairdressers. Do not let an electrician cut your hair. Darren. We're not playing a computer game here. Jobs aren't so easily interchangeable. I mean, what if you're from Washington, but you're into computers, and you want to get on board with the booming tertiary sector work that we've seen in the UK since the 60s? Most of those jobs are to be found in our big cities. And then what about those people who are driving to work in Washington? What else are they meant to do if they can't work there? I mean, Washington was designed as a key regional manufacturing centre. It's not like Honda have a factory in Houghton, is it? So aye, the idea of a town that provides everything you could ever need, though grand in theory, it just doesn't hold up to reality. That's just not how employment works. So, this mismatch between skills and jobs that we've got, what's the solution there? Wait.
Education, education, and education.
Obvious. But what if you don't want to be an automotive engineer? I mean, you could be if you wanted to. You're smart enough. But no, you want to do city stuff. I mean, you want to be a dancer. Woo! Yeah! Billy Elliot 2024 Laser Ballet. Yeah! Providing better educational opportunities to help people fit the jobs that are available locally, it's definitely something we should be offering. And obviously, advice should be there to make sure that young people are somewhat realistic in their goals. Or my dreams of being a professional footballer, shattered by the fact that you have to actually be good at football. Or Jack Rodwell. People born Alloa will have ambitions that can only be served by getting out of their hometown and travelling elsewhere. The days where every 16-year-old boy started working at a big local employer and stayed there for their whole working life, they're long gone. With it the idea that it'd be practical for most people to live down the street from their workplace. This brings up another big factor in poverty that shows up in Washington's data, one that finally gets at the topic of this video: transport. Washington was the 21st new town, so it uses a lot of learnings from earlier new towns. One major lesson came from the massive expansion in car ownership that took place in post-war Britain. In the 1940s, only around 10% of households had a car. By the mid-60s, this had risen to 40%, and all trends suggested it was going to continue increasing. When the plans for Washington were being drawn up in the early 60s, they projected that by the millennium there'd be 30,000 cars in town and designed the roads around this number. If we look at the data today, wow. Surprisingly, they've actually got that pretty spot on. Maybe they've even overestimated a little actually. Those planners really did seem to know their stuff. They said that cars would be the way of getting around, and this has worked out perfectly fine. Looking at traffic maps for the region, Washington's roads tend to be the most gridlock-free in all the land. Oh, wait. This is a perfect example of how statistics can mislead. If we look away from the DVLA's data about the overall number of cars, and instead towards the census's data and car ownership, about a quarter of households in the town didn't have a car. This rises up to around 50% in Concord, 70% in some census blocks. And surprise, surprise, these are the same parts of town where we see high indicators of deprivation. At risk of developing a catchphrase here, poverty and driving just do not go together. In modern Britain, without a car, even just getting to a job interview can be quite the epic mission. This cycle of car-free poverty, it can be really hard to break out of once you're trapped in it. So, it sucks to be poor. How about that for a controversial hot take? And aye, Washington is better for being car-free than, say, Allendale. Around the town centre, you see loads of people out walking. The galleries is really pretty centrally located. As well as its highway network, Washington was designed with pedestrian and cycle infrastructure in mind, and a lot of this was actually built. As pedestrian underpasses go, this one's pretty good. But if Washington has such low car ownership rates, then how come the projections for the number of cars were right? Well, Washington is a town of two halves. The 30,000 cars that the planners predicted, they are there, but they're really unevenly spread. As well as that quarter of households without cars, there's another quarter with more than one vehicle, which in itself can bring problems. Terraced housing is common across the region, and we all know how much of a problem parking can be there. In the future, with the rollout of electric cars and needing to plug in your car at night, this is going to be even more of an issue. Even for the parts of Washington built in the 60s and 70s, and designed with car ownership in mind, this was built on the idea of one 1960s sized car per household. Dad would be the only one going off to work in his modest minor, and the kids would be out living in their own place as soon as they turned 18. Having 2 or 3 much chunkier modern vehicles per household instead can really create quite the mess, really ruining how pleasant and child-safe an area is. A minor issue next to heating or eating, aye. Oh, poor little Tristan has to be driven to the polo club as our street's too full of Range Rovers and Mariah's penny farthing there. That's a typical middle-class scenario, innit? But it is worth remembering that as well as being bad for the poor, car centricity also hurts those who are doing okay financially. I can see how the naff streetscape might seem a price worth paying for many. You drive to work, you drive to the shops, you drive to the pub, you drive home, never having to interact with the community around you or anything that you don't specifically drive to. This is fine. What's more, due to the interplay between place and mindset, there's a big social expectation that you'll have a car. I mean, what lass in Washington's going to go out of a lad on a push bike? There's just this fundamental idea baked into you if you grow up in many parts of the country. It's one that's really hard to shake when it reflects the reality you see around you. That anyone who isn't a total failure in life will have a car. And, well, what other option is there? Force everyone to hike a mile and take one of the shaky, unreliable buses into the city? I'd argue, of course, that the key reason people have this mindset is that they just haven't experienced the alternative. It's not like this is a fault or anything. If you live in Washington today, then, yeah, having a car is just a sensible thing to do. But if this is you, then please do realise that living in a car-centric place and just doing without a car yourself, it's absolutely not reflective at all of how life is in places where owning a car is a choice. Places that aren't designed around the idea that everyone will have a car, which instead provide decent options for getting out of town without one. Washington may be a walkable town, but come on, people aren't spending their entire lives in Washington. They do want to get out sometimes. And the only really practical way to do this is by car. Washington doesn't have any sort of train or metro, and what buses it does have, not as bad as in many towns out in County Durham,
but still pretty atrocious for a town of its size and location, right in the middle of a big urban area. Living somewhere where popping to the pub isn't an epic mission of sorting out taxis, where you never have to worry about traffic or parking, and where people are actually forced to take notice of the community around them, isn't instant utopia in a bottle, but it does tend to make for a much more pleasant place to live. And besides, even if you're determined that you'll never give up your car, well, wouldn't it be nice if your neighbours weren't perpetually double parked all along your street? If there were half as many cars driving into town and scrabbling for parking spaces every morning? Which leads nicely onto my other catchphrase: it's not cars I'm against, it's the mandatory nature of car ownership. If you've not got heavy tools out like that to carry, then the reason you own a car should be because you want to own a car, because you're into cars, because you think driving's fun. Vroom vroom. Driving shouldn't be something you absolutely have to do just to live a normal life. Why should having a car be on the same level as food and shelter and warmth? Taking out the cost of buying a car in the first place, you're still looking at what, 2,500 quid a year to run a car? This is only going to get worse moving into the future. The days when having a car was just a basic default, that's steadily becoming unaffordable in many ways. Car centricity hurts individuals directly, and it weakens communities, creating segregation between the rich and the poor, and crushing any sense of place that a town might have. But not quite the embodiment of car centricity it's often presented as. A lot of Washington's problems are clearly born out of its car-centric design. Hey, how about that? I managed to spend a few minutes talking about the problem of car centricity without mentioning climate change even once. Though, that is a thing. But let's say you think global warming is all a big conspiracy of the Zoroastrian frogmen from Pluto. Well, most people don't agree, basically every expert included, but even completely ignoring this fundamental threat to life on Earth, the case against car centricity looms large. So, Washington. Well, you've got Google, you can go and see what people have to say about it online. Let's not write it off completely. Maybe all Washington needs is someone to show it a bit of love to help it get back on track.
On track? Rails? Train track? Trains! Ah! Whoa. Yeah, such a smooth connection.
Anyway, so you might have heard the factoid that Washington is one of the biggest towns in the country without a railway station. One ranking puts it fourth, just behind that Midlands Newcastle. I think we can all agree, putting aside practicality and funding and all that sort of thing, better transit would be an improvement for Washington, right? I mean, even if you're madly in love with your car and you'd never be without it, and just as long as it doesn't impact the roads, there's no harm in having a train or a metro, is there? Quickly looking at a map of Washington then, and getting out a crane, let's imagine we're being given a big sack of money to expand the metro to Washington. What would we do? Seems sensible to start at the end of the line in South Hilton. Make sure we get a lovely station at Penshaw here. We've got to serve all those Canadian pilgrims coming to see Lord Durham's monument. Then we hop over the river, might as well use the Victoria Viaduct. Then, the town centre of Washington's a natural target, innit? As I say, the galleries is a town centre. It's actually pretty geographically central in the town. It's where the main bus station is at the minute. I guess we'll sort of buzz up to there, then from there we'll go sort of northwest and let's make a nice metro line through the middle of Gateshead whilst we're at it. I'm not marking every station here, of course, just the main ones. Let's rejoin things at Gateshead Metro Station. Oh, struck me as a station just waiting for another line.
So, has anyone got a few billion to just blindly throw at this?
Yeah, no studies or anything, let's just do it. Nah, it's not even worth putting more than 5 minutes thought into, is it? It's never going to happen. Fortunately, we've got this Leamside Line thing just lying about. A ready-built track bed just sitting there, ready for someone to plug in the tracks and start running the choo-choos. So let's see where it runs and... Yep, the Leamside Line basically runs in the worst possible place for Washington.
To rub a bit of salt into that wound, this rubbish placement along the eastern fringe of town, it was entirely by choice.
Washington's train station closed in 1964, the very same year that the new town was designated. Passenger trains had absolutely zero role in their plans. According to mid-20th century urban design best practice, passenger rail just wasn't a thing worth thinking about. It was the past. Trains were old-fashioned and their time was done. The car was the future, and any forward-looking place would look to embrace it. As we've covered, Washington was all about making a sharp break from the past and boldly striding into the future.
Washington was built around the idea that most of the people who had come to live there would find new jobs there too.
They wouldn't have far to go for work. Walking, cycling, and of course cars would be the ways they'd get around. I mean, what sort of ridiculous future man wouldn't drive?
Washington's highways would also be used by the thousands who were driving from elsewhere to work.
The railway's sole role in the future was to be for freight. This is why Washington was designed with the main industrial zones being along this edge of town. It didn't improve the dismissive attitudes of Washington's planners that the Leamside Line really is a pretty old railway. It first opened in 1838, a few years before railway mania really got into gear.
The original concept behind the line was for taking coal between Houghton and Gateshead, with a link to Hartlepool to come later.
This never happened though, and the line instead found itself being used by trains between Darlington and Newcastle. It was part of the original East Coast Mainline between London and Edinburgh, until in 1872 they switched over to the Durham route that we know today. Off topic a bit, but I'd love to know why it came to be known as Leamside Line today. I just can't find a satisfactory answer to this. Leamside's a pretty insignificant village along its route. A quick glance at the satellite view and I count 20 something houses there? Look back over the entire history of the line and you'll see it was always a tiny place, much smaller than Rayton next door even. Some quick Google food doesn't tell us what the deal is here. Answers on a postcard to the usual address. Anyway, so after the main line switched to finally go through Durham, the Leamside Line continued to operate with some small-scale passenger traffic, but it mainly worked as a freight line and a key diversion route if there were any problems on the main line. The line closed to passenger services in 1964. Cheers, Beechin. But it kept being used for freight for a bit longer. That was stopped in 1991, just the year after the Victoria Viaduct received some significant modernisation works. It just goes to show, even in the British real times, thinking wasn't necessarily all joined up and sensible. Davies. Just to make you feel old, as I record this today, 1991 was 33 years ago. Today, along most of the route, there's no track to be seen, only this foot-hurting ballast. It's quite a fun story in there. Up till 2003, there was still a mothballed track sitting along most of the line. But over the course of a week, a criminal gang came in with all the proper gear like company high-vis jackets and tools and ting, and lifted a huge chunk of the track to sell for scrap. It was only when someone who actually worked for the company whose jackets they were wearing happened to pass by that they were found out. It's not like this track was still in working order, so before reopening it would have had to be replaced anyway. Here's the northernmost stretch of the line where the track does remain. But nonetheless, it just goes to show you quite how forgotten this line was, that some randomers could spend nearly a whole week nicking it, if it just been blind luck that led to him being caught.
As I mentioned, the Leamside Line runs between Newcastle and Darlington. Let's see just how it does that. Starting from the north, already marked, you can see the Green Line, the Metro and the East Coast Mainline. The Leamside Line is born here, just east of Pale Metro Station. It then curves to the south, going right around the edge of Washington. Former stations marked here just for reference. We'll then cross the Victoria Viaduct. After the bridge, the most common proposal you see popping up in the media every other year has the route turning eastwards and joining on to the end of the Metro line at South Hilton.
Which, means this wouldn't be a Leamside reopening as it never did this historically. Ha! Owned. And no, I'm not popular at parties. Why do you ask? There was a junction and a branch to Sunderland here historically, but it was south-facing only. You couldn't have gone between Washington and Sunderland this way. You'd also notice that this turning point here, it's a good half a mile north of Penshaw. Penshaw is a pretty decent sized town, which you'd think could really be helped by having a metro station. But all the station here really gives you is some farmers' fields. It's a fair hike for anyone, even from the town's northern fringes. Anyway, this section that you most commonly see being discussed only accounts for the first third of the line. I'd like to call this the Washington section. Annoyingly, no sooner had I started seriously writing the script for this video, then we got a major breaking news update about this very topic.
Then, as I continued to make the video, we got even more developments.
And well, isn't this splendid? Whoops, use my sarcastic voice there. It is splendid, it really is. I am keeping my enthusiasm squarely in check. This is just appointing legal advisors for the early stages of preparing a business case. It's not like it's an official definite go-ahead to start building the thing right now, or anything remotely like that. Proposed timelines are well into the next decade. Most projects that get to this stage go no further. But still, wonderful to see some movement in this part of the Leamside Line. We're getting ahead of ourselves here. I'll talk about reopening proposals a little later. We've still got 2/3 of the line to cover. Moving on then. Ignoring the Sunderland turn-off, the Leamside Line continues past the bit of Penshaw where all the people are. There's Shiny Row, fence houses. Quite a decent cluster of largish towns around here. Horton the Spring isn't too far away either. You're talking about a good 30,000-40,000 people or so living around this part of the line. Historically, you had stations at both fence houses and Penshaw. Past here, things get a bit more rural, with the Rayton and Leamside area having less than 5,000 people. On we go, pushing through the fields. The line passes 2.5 miles to the east of Durham city centre. More on that later. The final third of the line's pretty rural, with Sherburn and Bourburn, about 5,000 people each, being the most significant places. The Leamside Line then meets the East Coast Mainline here,
in Tersdale Junction, just north of Ferry Hill.
Let's call this southern 2/3 of the Leamside Line the County Durham section.
In recent years, there has been some buzz about reopening this bit of the line.
Right as I'm putting the finishing touches to the script and getting ready to assemble the video, we've got some news that this too is due to receive some money for investigation.
But generally, this gets mentioned a lot less than the Washington section, including by me. It's all Washington this, Washington that. Durham people, I am sorry. I hope I can make it up to you.
I suspect that this is due to being so much more marketable to talk of a new metro line than reopening a pretty redundant railway line for a fairly rural area. Unlike some other closed railway lines, map the Leamside Line onto population density, and you can really come to understand why it got the axe under Beecham. It's not really connecting any population centres, it barely buzzes past the edge of a few mid-sized towns. Nonetheless, I've done some investigation into past proposals for reopening the Leamside Line, dating all the way back to 1980, and it really has been talked about a hell of a lot. Let's take a quick look at some of them. So as I say, discussion around extending the metro to Washington goes right back to before the Leamside Line was even close to freight traffic. A lot of the early discussions revolved around track sharing arrangements. Back when the metro was new, there was a fair bit of excitement around it. Many locals assumed that it would only be a few years before the original network saw itself expanded dramatically into a proper London Underground sized network. Checking historic papers, I find mention of the council encouraging this, holding open days to share and get feedback on plans from the public. These articles were rarely particularly prominent, mind you, usually just small in-the-page columns in the local press only, but it was there. One of the main expansions talked about was of course the Sunderland. Indeed, the people of Sunderland paying for the metro through their taxes but not actually getting the metro was one of the main sources of conflict within the old Tyne and Wear metropolitan county. The Sunderland extension that we know today opened in 2002, following the route of the Durham coastline, but it could have been very different. Looking back to the early days of the metro, you see Washington's included in the mix of potential metro extensions alongside a lot of other wondrous fantasies. Some of these articles talk about official materials available to view, but unfortunately I haven't been able to find copies of them. Then they're of historic curiosity only. They clearly came to nothing and aren't particularly relevant to the modern discussion.
Sticking to the topic of historical curiosities then.
The first actual chunky official document I've been able to find on the topic of metro extension at Washington comes from 1991. It was produced by the consultants Davies, Gleave. This period presents a real what might have been, given it came just after mainline freight traffic stopped using the line. I haven't been able to find the full text of this report. The original had 10 options, but I've only been able to find documentation for 5 to 10. I can only guess that the first options largely dealt with the Durham coastline following the routes to Sunderland like the one we got. There are hints later in the document that option 3 and maybe option 4 do involve metro lines to Sunderland through Southwick. Anyway, looking at the options we do have details for though, number 5 deals heavily with the Leamside Line. One part of the text stands out for me. Just look at that. Wowzer, Channel Tunnel. Those were the days. Before low-cost airlines and various other issues around privatisation and Schengen destroyed the idea of regional Eurostar. Still, there are mutterings in more recent times of night trains between Edinburgh and the continent restarting. Someday. If we actually look at this option 5 then, the central point of this plan is a major interchange station around the A131, basically on the site of the old Usworth station. The idea presumably being the people from Washington would take the bus to this station and then they hop on a train to get to where they actually want to go. Which, I mean, if they're heading to Newcastle, it doesn't seem like the most efficient thing to do. They have some weirdly rural stations on this plan. And yes, I'm aware that Penshaw and Lambton are different places, but that's what the map says, no error on my part. Perhaps it's some kind of play of the Lambton worm myth, or cap tip to Lord Lambton, or who knows, it's mad. This plan has 6 stations in Sunderland before the mainline station. We've actually got 5 in reality. It seems we lost one of them at Pallion, which, you know, it's sensible really. There are too many metro stations in Sunderland at the minute, they're all a bit too clumped together. So far so basic, right? So, let's get sexy. Option 6 talks of a line following the same path from Palo to the A1290 where it stops. This option has the Washington interchange here. Taking a look at it on the ground. Hard to imagine, isn't it? It really doesn't look like much today, but this could have been a major transport hub for the region. With reference to an unseen option 3, hints suggest that option 3 might have been a metro through the middle of Washington. You don't just have buses stopping at this interchange, but also an LRT line, or as normal people call it, a tram. This runs from the galleries to Sunderland train station through Southwick. And real rule of cool stuff here, reopening the rail part of the Queen Alexandra Bridge to cross the river. Anyway, if you think option 6 something, let's move on to option 7. Now this makes a lot of reference to the unseen option 4, suggesting that was a metro line between the East Coast Mainline and Fatfield. This option talks of the same thing, but as a tram instead, which then from Fatfield turns north to link up to the LRT line at the galleries, and everything else we covered in option 6. Interesting point on this one, the Anfield Plain Line, today the coast-to-coast cycle lane up to Concert. It's still shown on their map as a real thing, despite the tracks having long since been lifted by that point. Option 8 presents a complete change of plan. The line leaves Gateshead Stadium and goes west. It then goes to the roundabout between Durham and Old Durham roads before going on street running straight down Durham Road, or alternatively Old Durham Road. Which, I mean, wow, that'd be something for Gateshead. This tram gets to Lowayton, where it turns east to go into Washington along the A1231. This kind of road skirting railway is pretty common in places like Switzerland and Germany. I am kind of on board with this idea, though in my version I'd be slightly realistic with turning south on the Leamside Line when it got there, whilst this one continues ever eastward. The core proposal is getting into Sunderland along the north bank of the Wear and joining the Durham coastline at Monk Wearmouth, with it looking like there's also an alternative option of using the Queen Alexandra Bridge. A tram through Gateshead up Durham or Old Durham roads, that's a really great idea. It was looked at a lot in later times, but it was ultimately rejected for what it would mean for road traffic and, cost of the bomb and all. But yeah, let's talk about trams another day. As first we've got option 9, which is even more extreme and detached from Leamside. From the Metro Centre, it uses the course of disused lines along the Tyne and under the King Edward Bridge. It then goes up through what at the time was a rail yard, but today is that residential area north of Askew Road. It then goes into a tunnel through to Central Gateshead, before then going down Durham Road and following the same course as option 8. Now this would have been fantastic, a metro to the Metro Centre, wow. That's really not what the topic of this video is meant to be. Absolute madness of a proposal. Finally then, their option 10, which drumroll please at the rate they're ramping up option by option. Surely this one will be some sort of mystical hyperloop that connects the Metro Centre to the galleries and then onto St Peter's Square, because why not? Love a bit of shopping to the Catholic priests. Nah, it's back to earlier proposals really. Goes down to the Leamside Line, then turns to street running to the galleries. Doesn't even bother with a Sunderland link. Honestly, this one does strike me as quite decent. Funny it's the last one on the list. So that was half of the Steers report from 1991. Most of this stuff was of course mad. It was never going to happen. But it's still really interesting to see that this is official work produced by big money professional consultancies. This isn't just me as a kid, who am I kidding me, last Tuesday, locked up in my room drawing lines on Google Earth. This was something the government paid real professional adult people big money to do. And what they came up with was often not a million miles away from ideas that myself and other random idiots online have come up with in the past. My big question is, how do I get paid bazillions to do this stuff? Let's have a metro between my house and my mum's. That'll be $1 million New Zealand dollars, please. Seriously though, it is amazing to see quite how big the thinking was back in the day. We could really do with bringing some of this back. Ultimately, the Sunderland extension went ahead, using perhaps the easiest option of following the Durham coastline and not touching Washington or the Leamside Line at all. This opened in 2002. The early 2000s seemed to be an exciting time for transit. With some echoes at the Davies situation, the Deputy PM John Bruiser Prescott had big plans, promising £180 billion turn under £70 to improve all aspects of transport in the UK. The centre point must be a massive investment in light rail nationally. Tyne and Wear wasn't missed out on this. We actually got the Sunderland extension. And then we had Project Orpheus. Project Orpheus, awesome name, really deserves a video all of its own. It was an epic plan to improve transport in the area across the board, with lots of investment in buses and trams. It was a pretty detailed investigation. They produced a cost-benefit analysis for a wide variety of possible routes. There were several parts of this relevant to looking at the Leamside Line in Washington. Some of the routes from the earlier plan were resurfaced. Routes number 5 and 6 in Project Orpheus involved Sunderland to Washington via South Hilton and via Southwick respectively. Project Orpheus's planned metro extensions overall were heavily reliant on tram-style street running. Both links to Washington were solidly rejected due to estimated poor economic performance. However, an extension from South Hilton to a new station on the Leamside Line is mentioned as an alternative. I get the impression here that they're talking about a standalone Penshaw metro station / mainline station on the end of the Sunderland line. Project Orpheus's route number 8 was a tram from Washington to Gateshead that didn't touch the Leamside Line at all. This was rejected due to there being no room for segregated running, with super route buses mentioned as the alternative used instead. You've also got Route 15A, South Shields to Washington, for minimal 35% street running, also rejected in favour of buses. Where are they? The best cost to benefit ratio across all these proposals is 0.5 to 1, which isn't great. As said, I want to look at Project Orpheus in more detail another day. The Leamside Line wasn't really covered much by it, with its focus being very much on trams. Moving on, at a similar time to Project Orpheus, there was also the Tyneside area multimodal study. Get a load of these schoolboy charts. Really takes you back. What a way to butcher potentially useful data. In this study, it got a lot of examination of the problems of the north and the brewing capacity problems on our roads. The Leamside Line reopening gets a mention in the context of
the proposed reopening of the Leamside Line is intended to release passenger service capacity on the East Coast Mainline, largely by the transfer of freight traffic to the route. This would constrain proposals to reintroduce passenger services on this line. Which, yeah, very definitely is a good use of the Leamside Line. So much of the excitement you see around its reopening revolves around the fabled metro to Washington, but increasing capacity on the East Coast Mainline, though far less sexy, would bring huge benefits. It could, for instance, open up the possibility of more local stations on the East Coast Mainline. It gives an estimated cost of $42 million for reopening the Leamside Line, which, man, if only. Even ignoring that these are prices from over 20 years ago and the effects of inflation, we all know that it would have been destined to bloat enormously. It's an interesting report from the past, which covers a lot of the stuff I look at these days. Interested to see its projections for how things will come to change in the decades to come, and where they've worked out and where they haven't. But not much to be seen around Leamside. Onwards through history then. Talk of the metro to Washington sort of died a death for a while. Project Orpheus showed light rail link wasn't economically viable, reopening the Leamside Line. Well, you know the UK and trains. The Leamside Line did get a mention in the 2009 Connecting Communities report. This was a national study that was basically the undoing beaching restoring your railway levelling up fund thingy, but 10 years earlier, and without needing the old Brexit gun to the head. Leamside got a good write-up as one of the routes for positive benefits to cost ratio for reopening, 1.4 in its case. Which, curious, isn't it? The Washington section, the one that gets all the attention, was expected to give us a pretty miserable 50 pence back for every pound spent, whilst here with the Cattery Dome section, they're expecting each pound invested to generate £1.40 worth of value. We're looking at data from two totally different studies from the noughties here. There'll be different methodologies and they won't directly translate to the modern day, but I do think there could still be something here that's worth plugging in new numbers to see where it ends up. This document again speaks a lot about the Leamside Line in the context using it as a backup for the East Coast Mainline, which allows for better operation of a true 7-day railway and all that sort of thing. Now I know, backups aren't sexy. Their benefit isn't immediately obvious to regular people, especially those who live along the backup, but they are great to have, just in case. The Connecting Communities report suggests reopening Leamside as part of the National Rail Network, with the only station being one in Washington, with possible investigations to be done for stations in other towns. It even mentions the proposed service here, the hourly Trans-Pennine Newcastle to Manchester Airport train being redirected down Leamside. Contrary to the earlier fantastical musings that were found to be uneconomic, this one's really quite an encouraging report, which seems to suggest good things were on the way. But it was 2009. That was the midst of the financial crisis. Poor Gordon Brown. We're lucky he was there, he was the right man at the right time. With any grand plans he might have had to do more as Prime Minister than just stop a complete financial collapse, he utterly died a death with everything that happened. Through the early 2010s, the idea sorta continued to exist, being kicked about by campaign groups like Real Future, but the atmosphere of the time being what it was, austerity and all that, actually improving the railways or anything really, wasn't politically popular. In 2012, more of the track that remained on the line was lifted before it was nicked, which was quite a psychological blow. And from what I can gather, all was pretty quiet. Some slight local rumblings from the North East Local Enterprise Partnership, who commissioned a study into Leamside Line's reopening in 2014. This same year, there was also some work from the North East Combined Authority, which eventually gave her the 2016 Metro Futures report. Lots of stuff to unpack in this one, and it's recent enough directly connected to more recent plans that it can be counted as effectively still relevant, and not just a fun historic curiosity. Under its Leamside Line heading are 4 different services to be implemented. The first one is where you see the first appearance of the Wayside Loop idea. It takes the classic South Hilton to Pale Hall line, but for some reason, rather than continuing on to Newcastle, they instead have it turning at Pale Hall to go back to Sunderland instead. Now, loop lines that are cool, they look very nice on a map, of that there's no doubt, but they're usually what you have in the innermost sections of major cities. For instance, London's Circle Line-ish, or the Yamanote Line in Tokyo. As lovely as it is, I'm not quite sure Bolden's on the same level as Shibuya. Second, rail service between new stations at Belmont and Durham, Fence Houses and Penshaw, throughout to Sunderland, Newcastle and surprisingly, South Shields, via a freight line at Biddercall. Now this is a cool thought, mainline service to Shields. But they've just spent all that money on a new metal station for South Shields, and specifically made it single track only, which seems kind of unwise for a wide variety of reasons. Regardless, this little freight line to Shields, it's a bit outside the scope of this current video, but it's definitely something I'm aware of and think we really need to try and make use of in the future. Third in their Leamside strategy, more freight capacity and relieved pressure on the East Coast Mainline. Yep, standard stuff there, good. And at the end, they mention using the Leamside Line as potential place for a high speed route, which is interesting.
It aligns with some thoughts I've had about high-speed rail in the region, but that's really going off into fantasy territory these days and quite a topic for another day. Following 2016 then, everything went on hold for a while, didn't it? People were otherwise engaged. Not a great year 2016. Putting on a happy face though, in recent years we have seen a massive uptick in reporting about the Leamside Line reopening. For instance, an article from the Chronicle in 2019 spoke of planning rules shake-ups that will make a metro extension easier. As it's the Chronicle, they're quite sensationalist and speak of a metro to Seam and Ferry Hill, which, no. But it's been discussed. Moving on then. In 2020, there was another big development, with the Restoring Your Railways Fund being announced. It was a very typical Boris Johnson policy, of talking big, but delivering very little. The Leamside Line was one of dozens of projects across the country, and saw hefty dossiers compiled and submitted to gain part of the 500 million funding offer. But given we were only talking about 500 million available to share across basically every local rail project in the country, it's can be expected a lot of this was just completely wasted effort and was ignored. No surprise to hear the Leamside Line was amongst those that didn't get any money. But more positively, the Restoring Your Railways Funds did seem to kick some life into calls for reopening the Leamside Line, with a cross-party group of local MPs continuing to carry it forward and press for funding. Some big news came in October 2023, with the announcement that out with the scrapping of High Speed 2, the Leamside Line was going to get funding to be reopened. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. It actually was going to happen. For years, the anti-HS2 campaigners had been going on and on about how we could spend the money better elsewhere, and now it seems that they weren't just making bad faith arguments, it was actually going to happen. While did I ever had to be eaten? No. Within 24 hours this was cancelled. When our cross-party group of MPs went to meet the Transport Minister about this, they were told that all hope for funding lay in the North East Devolution deal and the £1.8 billion pot that would gammer that. In 2018, Transport North East was funded, giving us a regional body to look at transport on a holistic level, with representatives from all the local authorities taking part. A strategic outline case for the Washington Metro loop was done, and it covered the standard Sunderland to PLO route with consideration of two options for getting the South Shields. There's lots of lovely facts and figures outlined here. They claim Washington is the fourth largest town without rail service, the amounts to be added to the economy, and 38 to 105,000 people were going to be given better access to transit, eliminating 1.7 million car journeys a year, which is spiffy. There's really lots to excite me here, but apparently every metro taken in the region generates £11.80. Somehow. I really wonder how to figure that out. I'm all for arguments for more transit, but I'm also into facts and figures, and I'd love them to show the working. Anyway, stepping forward to the hyper-modern space age of 2024, and we're seeing some serious progress, with some proposals steadily developing even as I speak, causing rewrite after rewrite. As was said when talking about the potential reopening of the Leamside Line, there's two main schools of thought. Firstly, there's reopening the full Leamside Line, the County Durham route. This proposal keeps hanging on. It got a mention by our old friend Ian Mearns in Parliament.
Ian Mearns. Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the North East has been underfunded in terms of transport investment for decades. HS2, meant to be an economic development and connectivity lifeline, now not coming anywhere near. And the A1 Northumberland dualling decision delayed yet again, and our regional rail services still running on outdated infrastructure and rolling stock. With all that in mind, will the Prime Minister commit to funding to reopen the Leamside Line from Gateshead to County Durham to take pressure off the East Coast Mainline and aid economic well-being movement of passengers and freight services in the North East of England, or is levelling up just a rhetoric?
So that's how he actually sounds. And before the election anyway, support continued from every local MP whose seat it touched, from both of the main parties. In March 2024, we saw $350,000 given for an investigation into the reopening. Now that's a pittance in government spending terms really, but still it's something. In July 2024, the North East Mayor, Kim McGuinness, gave $600,000 more to put together a strategic outline case for what they're calling Leamside South. Past investigations have already shown that reopening this part of the Leamside Line makes sense. So hopefully this cash will stretch to just updating the figures being plugged into the sums and things will still add up right. Though with the way the cost of doing anything in the UK has shot up this past decade, it's quite the coin toss. The main focus at the moment though lies around the Washington section and the previously mentioned South Tyneside loop. This plan is in a more advanced state than the reopening Durham section, and it is getting a lot more funding. At the same time that the Durham section was getting $600,000 from the Mayor, she was throwing $8 million at this. Though still, hold your horses, that's still just for putting together a business case, rather than putting any shovels in the ground.
Since 2022, there's been a lot of local government work going on around reopening the Washington section. There's been several requests put out for vendors to contribute. For instance, this one asking for legal services. As much as the mayoral campaign might have passed under most people's radar, I couldn't help but notice that the two leading candidates, Jamie Driscoll and eventual winner Kim McGuinness, both heavily talked up the Leamside Line in their manifestos. Driscoll even had this funky retro map of an extensive regional network to show. Ooh. McGuinness, meh, less flashy in the campaign, but she does seem to actually be chasing it up since she won. Hopefully for competent government now in power in London, something will happen. As you've seen, the main way reopening the Leamside Line tends to get mentioned, as the best way to extend the metro by going to Washington, the last done metroed major town in Tyne and Wear. But, really? Is that really a good idea? Under plans as they stand, you'll get metros going around Washington in a sun-centric circle, kinda like this. Plans are really vague, so disclaimer, this is just a best guess. Curious though that there's no link to Newcastle. Not knocking Sunderland here, but a lot of Washington people might want to go there too. And Brits just different to connecting services as instinctively as people in Tokyo might. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt, and assume that the map we're looking at is something like this, with a Newcastle link in there too. Which looks lovely in theory, doesn't it? But you have to ask, just what sort of frequency are they expecting here? For proper metro quality service, research suggests that you need a train every quarter of an hour, absolute minimum. Even this is pushing the level where people will feel comfortable just turning up without checking the timetable. Considering we've got two lines here, you're basically talking a train every 6-7 minutes coming to here. Is that really viable? Yeah, to Sunderland and Newcastle, maybe? You do get at least 3 or 4 buses per hour from Washington to each city. Broadly, the demand is sort of there, and consider too the amount of people who won't take a bus but might take the metro. But then we aren't talking about a nice central station at the galleries here. This line's way out on the eastern fringe of town. I really have my doubts on the current viability of these links. In a word, the key problem we're looking at here is density. Transit needs to actually connect things. If you have too few people in an area, then the viability of transport drops off dramatically. I mean, it's not for nothing that Chillingham Road in Heaton has a metro station, whilst Chillingham, up the Annick, gets a bus every 3 hours. There isn't really such a thing as a universally accepted optimum population density. It's all very situational. But one bit of research from Canada found that for a decent public transport system to operate, you need 11,500 people per square kilometre for a subway, 7,000 for a tram, and 5,000 for a bus. Washington, as it is, really pushes viability even for buses, which might help to explain a little bit why its bus service is so bad. You do get a few census blocks for 7,000 people, but also some pretty vast tracts with just a few hundred. For an average of the whole town, you're looking at less than 3,000 people per square kilometre, which is really canny naff. Following the Leamside Line means skirting the very fringe of Washington, where on the west side you've generally got pretty decent density above 7,000 in many places, whilst on the other side, well, except for Teal Farm down by the river, you've just got factories and fields. This gives you an average population density of 3, maybe 4,000 people max around the line, and that's nowhere near what you need, even for a tram, let alone a metro. So are you really expecting a metro here to be viable? You might be saying, aye, but that's Canada, this isn't Canada. You can't just apply research from Canada to Britain. But this isn't an idea completely alien to the British government either. Looking at this 1997 research they commissioned into lessons from the new towns, for instance, it clearly identified in Milton Keynes the problem of trying to retrofit 20th century car-centric towns to a 21st century public transit orientation. So going on and on like a broken record, the metro to Washington, with its low density issues, it's already going to be tough, even if you can get a station in the town centre. But it's hard to imagine a worse placement for a metro in Washington than on the Leamside Line. Skimming the edge of town is not how metros are meant to work. In case you didn't notice, I'm really dubious on this South Tyneside loop idea. I mean, yeah, I get it. Who doesn't like choo-choos? And loop lines are cool. Washington is a major employment area. Giving the people of Jarrow better access to those jobs, lovely. And Sulgrave Road is definitely a bit of Washington, could do with a bit of leg up. But in practical terms, just how viable would this link be as things stand? The politicians are barreling ahead with this. Some pretty serious money's been put on the table, and Kim McGuinness is nailing her colours to the mast. Maybe there's data out there I've not seen which disagrees with me on this all. But from what I have seen, there's a ton of unmet preconditions needed before the South Tyneside Loop can become remotely viable. The over-the-top focus on this South Tyneside Loop, it really seems quite misplaced. There's better places to be spending limited transit funds, the Bencham Curve for instance. Or if we're going into the land of dreamy big money spending and massive infrastructure projects, the West End of Newcastle? If it were up to me, I reckon we should put the Washington to South Tyneside section to the side for now, as one for the future rather than a current priority. Nonetheless, the facts are what they are. The political transit focus is on the prospect of reopening the Leamside Line, in particular a Metro line to Washington, and there is an unused railway line just sitting right there. Maybe we could use a bit of joined up thinking and make something good of this after all. You'll probably notice, across all these proposals that have been discussed over the years, there's one pretty notable omission, given the way I started this video and all that. The Belmont Viaduct. The thing I said had the potential to be absolutely transformative for Wayside. Now it's time for the section that I call...
I know better than all the experts. I know better than all them experts.
Yeah. I know better than all the experts. I do. Aye. Hopefully that song warns you of the quality standard of what you're getting here. Going forwards, aye, be careful. As per usual, big disclaimers here. Despite the research I put into this, fundamentally it is all just the rambling of a single divvy who's a bit too into this stuff. I'd even have a team of specialist engineers and accountants and all the rest of the gang to properly run the sums and any of it. Getting on with it though, here's an overview map of rail lines in the area. Here's the East Coast Mainline, and here's the Leamside Line. Do you notice how they're neatly parallel each other? As things stand, Durham City isn't really accounted for much by any of the Leamside Line chat. The only way it tends to get mentioned is through the construction of a second Durham station in Belmont, totally detached from the current station on the East Coast Mainline. But surely I'm not the only one thinking that sounds really inelegant. It sounds like something from the Victorian age, with different train companies that all have their own stations dotted around towns, no integration between them at all. In Belmont, I mean people do live there, and it's already where you'll find a major bus park and ride just off the A1. I guess the train could fit into this. You take the train to Belmont Station, then hop on the bus to get into the centre of Durham or the university or wherever. But however, come on, realistically Durham isn't Newcastle. Whilst the Newcastle urban area has 800,000 or more people, depending on your definition of course, always a hazy thing, Durham has more like 50,000. Having an extra mainline train station there, it just adds needless complications to Durham's connections. I mean, it'd be useful for people on the east side of the city to not have to go to the city centre to catch a train to Newcastle or Darton. And people from elsewhere in County Durham could benefit from not needing to go into the middle of Durham too. But the cons of fragmenting Durham's transport system along two parallel lines like this, they really do seem to outweigh the pros. And this is where the Belmont Viaduct comes in. If we bring that into our plans, then the situation looks quite different. Rather than being a tiny afterthought, by making use of this long-forgotten bridge, Durham will instead form the linchpin of the local rail network. I admit, it was something that just came to me whilst I was idly looking at maps. But as it turns out, there's nothing new under the sun. This has actually been looked at seriously in the past. One place, for instance, came from High Speed 2 Limited, back in the days when they were young and full of hope, and thought they might one day stretch as far as the northeastern Scotland. They mentioned the Durham bypass as a key need for their services. Now, I expect in their plan, they would not have reused the Belmont Viaduct, and rather they would have built something new and shiny and, well, high speed. Their only focus was on trains getting from Newcastle to the south, so they could have given this track a fairly straight north to south alignment. And hey, I admit it, I've not done an engineering study. Maybe the existing bridge is absolutely impractical for modern trains, and it'd make a lot more financial sense to build a new one. It'd be a bit of a shame if so. Reduce, reuse, recycle. And, rule of cool, it is a canny pretty bridge. Anywho, ultimately irrelevant. The key point is that a connection across the way around here somewhere, it'd be revolutionary for the region.
Looking at my plan then. At the minute, this is how the East Coast Mainline services work. They shoot up through Darton, Durham and Chelsea Street, then they get to Newcastle, and from there they usually continue on to Edinburgh. With the Leamside Line reopened, services could instead look like this. For some trains to Newcastle, it'd be business as usual. For others, however, there's a new diversion route available. It's a bit of a longer way around, but it does increase capacity a fair bit. For Sunderland, you'd see some pretty big changes though, as rather than clattering up the Durham coastline, you'd have a much more straightforward, east side avoiding path to the East Coast Mainline. And the world beyond. This also gives you a direct link between Sunderland and Darton, which, wait, I'm sure that's a big deal for some people, but most importantly, it frees up the coastline for more local services. Metro to see anyone? Do look out for my future video on that topic, currently penciled in for 2037. Tidying up the crash debris then, do remember, in reality, Newcastle Central Station does not force all trains onto a single line.
Well, under my proposal, local rail connections to the south would look more like this. Newcastle trains would use the East Coast Mainline to get past Durham at a higher speed than normal. Sunderland trains, meanwhile, whilst they could follow Leamside right home, would instead loop around the existing East Coast Mainline to make sure that Durham isn't losing its links to the south. I hope the Mackham's different mind hanging on an extra few minutes to again drop people off in Durham. It also gives us something we're really missing today, a connection between Durham and County Durham's historic biggest city. Maybe it's just rule of cool speaking here, rather than any practical advantage, but I can't help but imagine a long train coming up from the south, stopping at Darlington, and from there most of it continues on to Newcastle and Edinburgh, whilst the back detaches to nip across to Durham and Sunderland. I love the Tokukatsu vibes. People of the North East combine into a Geet Big Train! I mean, it works kinda well in Japan with a mini Shinkansen, but probably best to avoid adding unnecessary moving parts. Whether or not we're playing Power Rangers here, what we'll get is a clear segregation of the pattern for the non-stop trains, for instance the 7am Newcastle to King's Cross one, and desperately needed local services that stop at every station. I mean, just imagine that, a train every 20 minutes or so between Durham, Chester and Newcastle, and one between Durham and Penshaw and Sunderland as well. I do think that this Durham bypassing, Sunderland Durham Lincoln, mainline backup, pin, use of the Leamside Line has enough value in its own right to see it done, even without considering any new stations along its route. While we're at it though, there are some spots where, without changing anything, there'd be a good case for a new station. Ferry Hill, for example, has already been looked at, and it clearly makes sense, even without the Leamside Line. And then around the fence houses, Shiny Row sort of area, that demands at least one station. We've got a good 30-40,000 people living near the line here, and another 36,000 over in Houghton-le-Spring. Reopening the Leamside Line and adding these new stations, aye, that'd be lovely, wouldn't it? There's a clear case for it, and it'd really improve transit in the region. But it's a shame really that this is all you can rationally really make a case for the current situation. As we've mentioned there's a huge problem with the Leamside Line in that the potential catchment area for most new stations covers little beyond empty fields. You'll have noticed in my Durham focus plan for the Leamside Line, the oft talked about Washington Metro, it's completely excluded. Even as far as mainline trains go, I don't really see the need to use the Washington bit for much more than as a backup of a freight. If you're going to be driving to the train station, then having it at Shiny Row would serve Washington just as well as one on the actual eastern edge of town. Which, it kinda sucks for Washington. I mean, yeah, the Leamside Line is in a rubbish place, but that doesn't change the fact that Washington is one of the biggest towns in the country without a train station, and it has a dire need for better transit. Is there really now what we can do to make the dreams of a metro line to Washington become reality? There is. Solution time. Now, please bear with me here, as I'm going to be getting a bit outside the box. Again, I really need to point to the disclaimer that I'm just some powerless nobody, as honestly, my solution for how we fix the idea of a metro extension to Washington, it's really canny mad. There's truly crazy stuff here that flies well outside what seems politically possible in 21st century Britain. So, without further ado, and at risk of making myself look like an absolute lunatic, my batshit idea for how we get this Washington Metro built is... build more bloody houses! I know. You've stuck with us so far, but I've really jumped the shark on this one. Someone get a doctor in here, this man has clearly gone insane. As controversial as it is to say though, I do think we could do with just a little bit more housing in the region. I mean, yeah, I know, building houses, what kind of solution's that? Why don't we just do what we always do and blame foreigners instead? I mean, that always works. Balls to this joint up holistic thinking claptrap. But no, bear with us here. There are very slight hints that we might have a bit of a housing crisis going on. In Durham City in particular, things seem to be a bit terrible. And looking at the data, last year the region's social housing waiting list shot up 51%. That's the worst rate of increase in the whole of England. Private sector rents have gone up a fair bit too, as have house prices. Aye, housing in Britain is truly shite. What's this got to do with the actual topic of this video though? That people cannot afford rent is a big problem, it's very sad. But how's a disused railway line that mostly goes past Nout but empty land's going to help? Well, guess what the main ingredient in building new housing is?
Huge tracts of land!
And I've already talked about how it'd be a misuse of the Leamside Line to use it to extend the metro to Washington, as there just isn't enough population density to support it. I'm sure we've all heard the expression, to kill two birds with one stone. By using these empty fields on the edge of Washington to build new housing, we can massively reduce our region's housing issues and make it viable to provide quality transit to the people already living there. What I'm suggesting here is transit-oriented development. You tend not to see this too much in modern Britain, but internationally and in historic Britain, it's common practice. A lot of the historic growth of London followed this Metroland model. Rail lines were built out into green fields and fresh housing was built alongside them. Or hell, even just looking locally, Gosforth really got put on the map as a railway suburb for Newcastle. The simple fact is, if we want a metro to Washington, then we need it to go back to its new town roots. Entirely new communities need to be built in the fields on the eastern edge of town. Aye, I know. It's just that simple, isn't it? Just build more houses. There, housing crisis solved. Great idea, Sherlock. Why has nobody ever thought of that one before? Yeah, I know. Of course, the reality is a lot more complicated than this. Getting outbuilt in the UK, it's an absolute nightmare. Likely key to why we always see developments on random fields, far from anything, is that there's just fewer people to moan about how that particular patch of grass is where to walk the dog. As I mentioned earlier, the planning system in the UK, it's an absolute nightmare. I've already touched on this, but to avoid going off on too much of a tangent, it really needs to change. And there are vibes that change could be on the way when they get their fingers out. But let's pretend things do work the way the Facebook commenters think they do. So I've now got supreme power. From my chase long I declare, I'm hungry, builders of Mackie D's at this spot here right now. My planning underlings scuttle away to see my will be done. Finished in a week. So all this new housing with attached train stations that I want to build then, where would I put it? Well, we've already talked about Washington. If we're going to be building a metro line here, then we need some pretty beefy density out there. Where exactly the station should be is up for debate, but wherever we do put them, everywhere within 10 minutes walk should be developed. I didn't mean like concrete as far as the eye can see here. You need parks, playgrounds, trees, all that sort of thing too, but no more empty fields. Use the land efficiently. I'd guesstimate we need around 3 or 4 stations in Washington, so I'd place them and their new housing here. It's not just with the Washington section where new housing could really help the region and improve the viability of the Leamside Line. Shiny Row, fence houses, Penshaw. South of the river, it's usually the western side of the line which is empty. Ideally, I'd like to see all 3 of these places with a new station. Perhaps this could be done in phases rather than all at once. In my mind, however, undoubtedly the main place I think could really do with some major housing development is in the namesake village of our lovely line, Leamside. We've already mentioned that Durham has massive housing issues. Is yet more car-focused sprawl really the answer to this? Traffic getting into the city centre is already bad enough. Nah, any sensible plan for expanding Durham's housing stock, it cannot be solely reliant on the roads. I reckon that the wee little village of Leamside should become one of the region's core development areas. With a new rail link and extensive house building here, we could really do a lot to solve Durham's housing problems. Ganning off on a bit of a tangent, and wouldn't that be a first? What I'd really love to see established in Leamside is basically a northern Poundbury. If you're not familiar with Poundbury, it's basically a 21st century new town that King Charles III, back when he was a mere Prince of Wales and Duke of Cornwall, built on the edge of Dorchester. Aye, I know. If your thinking's out like mine, then you might have jumped straight to, oh, the King's little private play town. Well, that might fly with a la-di-da hooray Henry set down there, but it doesn't really do much for normal local people, does it? You stinking poo-poo face person, you. Look into Poundbury a bit though, and you'll see that the King, or rather the planners that he hired, they actually did a hell of a lot right. Its core design philosophy is about building on a human scale, perfectly showing how to do density in an efficient yet traditionally British way. It has new builds that actually look nice, and something that I find really quite impressive. Whilst house prices in Poundbury have shot up since they were first built, it keeps a third of its housing scattered about the town and basically indistinguishable from the rest as affordable social housing. I've already mentioned that this mixing of people from all walks of life, it's something I'm really keen on. It has so many advantages, and being so bad at this is another key negative of car-focused urban design. Poundbury isn't perfect, of course. It definitely has its problems. It does a good job of being a human-focused walkable town, but like in Washington, they didn't really consider what would happen if people wanted to leave the town, which in a rural place like Dorchester means cars. I know some people who live down that way, and no joke, I do hear they have big issues with parking. Also a problem with Poundbury is that its construction has really crawled along at a slug's pace, and there's also been some reporting of overly strict rules about how you can and can't alter your own house. Real wee Happy Few vibes if you've ever played that one. So I'm not saying to copy Poundbury exactly, but if we lift some of its more successful ideas and meld them with a bit of transit-oriented development best practice, with this site on the edge of Durham built around a train station, I do think there's a perfect opportunity to build a really great community, somewhere that'd be a lovely place to live in its own right, with easy access to all of our region cities. I know he's probably been a bit busy since his promotion and he doesn't really have time for housing anymore. Does anyone have Charlie's contact details? Before moving on, just for the sake of completeness, let's look south of Durham and, well, there's definitely a bit of space for new housing down there. Local development plans already call for a lot to be built around Bourburn. But bear in mind, towns like Ferry Hill are famous for having some of the lowest house prices in the UK. Maybe developers can plan ahead. If you build it, they will come, buy up the land and build new housing before the demand really takes off. People around Ferry Hill and other surrounding villages seem to want more expensive, not less expensive housing, which is a simply bizarre problem to have in 2024 Britain. Reopening Ferry Hill railway station, just south of the junction between the Leamside and East Coast Mainline, would really make for quite a nice little interchange station and really help the village to thrive. So let's put a little note on that one for some future development. In conclusion, anyone still watching? In conclusion, I do believe that by reopening the Leamside Line and the Belmont Viaduct, everyone's a winner. Newcastle gets extra capacity quicker trains to the south, and anyone working in town gets broader options of places to live that didn't put a gun to the head and demanded to get a car or else. Washington gets trains, and a nice batch of modern and dare I hope affordable housing, plus better access to its eastern industrial estates. Durham? Oh, don't you worry, Durham. It might have seemed with my proposal that I was taking away your links to Newcastle, but that couldn't have been further from my mind. Though yeah, the increasingly mashed football fans on your train south will now be wearing different coloured stripes. Do note that by doing this, would have freed up a lot of capacity on the East Coast Mainline around Durham. Durham would no longer have to suffer the indignity of trains whooshing through without stopping, and instead we could use the main line for more local traffic. A new station up towards Brasside seems a no-brainer, though yeah, I do expect the Chronicle comments section to be full of Al-Gadgis thinking they're being clever, going on about how to make prison escapes easier. It wouldn't. Do I need to say that? It's just a shame that Pity Me's a touch too far west, as that would make for a fantastic station name. I mean, just imagine the announcer proclaiming every day on your journey to work, "Next stop, Pity Me." Anyway, Langley Moor as well could be a great place for a little local station, and maybe some new housing while we're at it. A key source of Durham's housing friction is the university, which is down at that side of the city. Purpose-built student flats are a far better and more efficient way to house students than converting family homes for the purpose. So let's build some here. If we combine this Belmont Viaduct Leamside reopening plan with my previous video stuff about the Bencham Curve, there's even a chance you could get metro level service down to Durham, as there'd no longer be that much of the line at all that you'd have to share with LNER's trains up to Edinburgh. On the topic of places that benefit from the Leamside Line, hopping back Sunderland Way, Horton, Penshaw, all that area, again this line puts them on the map, gives them a reliable and practical option for living car free that doesn't involve rolling a dice and hoping the bus turns up. Finally, a place that is really a key beneficiary for reopening the Leamside Line, but which I've only really mentioned in passing so far, Sunderland. It's got its direct link to the main line back and all that goes with that, but this isn't the main place that Sunderland benefits that I see. Nah, Sunderland's main gain is in the direct Durham link. It doesn't seem like that much of a big deal, but I really do think this could massively help both cities. Aye, it'd be a big help when the football's on, of course, but thinking beyond that, in Sunderland and Durham, you essentially have two polar opposite cities. Durham's posh, man. I know, it does have its rough bits. Along Giles Gateway there's a fair few hard nuts to be found. But overall, looking at the index of multiple deprivation, Durham basically shines for a complete lack of deprivation. The uni is really growing a ton, and in this day and age there's quite a desire from wealthy middle class people to live in lovely historic towns. And who can blame them? But this has largely pushed the working class out of the city and into the surrounding villages, where you simply have to have a car, or else. Nip across to Sunderland on the other hand, and Christ, oh my god, I spent so much of the video speaking about how rough bits of Washington are, but next to Sunderland proper, man, Washington's basically Richmond. It definitely has its nice bits. If I was moving to the region from elsewhere, and I didn't have family or friends or work out like that to think about, then Walker would definitely be near the top of the list of places I'd want to live. The bad side of Sunderland though, yeah, Washington has quite a few areas in the bottom third for deprivation, ranking 10,000 or so out of 32,000 areas in the country. In Sunderland, you've parts of the city cracking the top 1,000. Purely looking at data, please don't kill me if you're watching this, the worst is Hendon, just east of the city centre, which is the 167th poorest bit in all of England and Wales. There's myriad reasons for this, and large part it's a microcosm of the region as a whole, the loss of the mines and the shipyards and, you know, all the general shite we've been through. But the historic mistakes of Sunderland City Council shouldn't be overlooked either. Though Washington gets a lot of stick for its car centricity, its issues are now next to those of Sunderland overall. So much of the city's employment was specifically encouraged to leave the city centre and go to godforsaken places like Doxford Park. Walk around the city centre itself and it's clear to be seen how car-focused its planners have been. Sunderland as a whole ranks 22 out of 316 local authorities in the country for income deprivation levels. In terms of income disparity, that's how segregated the rich and the poor are, something that's tightly related to car centricity. Sunderland ranks 26th. I know, some gits might look at this stat and think keeping the poor as far away as possible is actually a good thing, but no, again, it isn't, and that's speaking in terms of data, as well as basic human decency. On so many metrics, it tends to be better to have doctors and 0-hour contract cleaners living side by side, their kids going to the same schools and so on, and for them to exist in completely different worlds, always averting the eyes in the corridor at work. Linking up Sunderland and Durham won't magically solve Sunderland's poverty issues or Durham's housing crisis, but it will help spread opportunities for housing and employment across the whole of Wearside, rather than keeping the two cities in strictly separated bubbles. Tying in Durham with the rest of Wearside could be just the push that the uni needs to become the Cambridge of the North that it fancies itself as, which would have positive effects for the whole region, not just the pointy hats in the uni. Sunderland, on the other hand, is a city that's really in need of a serious economic boost, and tying it closer together with the opportunities in Durham and Darlington and the country beyond, it could really do a lot to help move the needle on so many metrics. So, there we go then. That's me video on the Leamside Line. Hopefully something of this will come to pass. As well as me shout out for King Charles's contact details, I'd also like to ask if anyone has an in with Kim McGuinness that they can share. Transport does seem to be one of the main priorities she's taking on as Mayor of the North East, and she just needs to be told that the current plans for reopening the Leamside Line, they need a bit of work. I really do think that an approach that's something like the one I outlined here, looking at mass house building alongside reopening the line, it's the only way to do it successfully. As said, I recognise that building housing in this country is a lot easier said than done. 12 fingers crossed that Labour's talk of planning reform and actually try to tackle the housing crisis isn't going to be a broken promise. But if they do start making progress there, how about giving Scotland a break and trying it in the North East first, eh? So as I was making this video, news just kept coming out about the Leamside Line, and given the amount of constituencies it touches, politically I do think we're in for a good shot of something happening. Or at least that's what I wrote before the finish line was in sight for this video, and we got a whole heap of bad news with Labour revealing the economy was a mess, and that railway funding was going to be slashed. McGuinness and co still sound positive though, so let's see. Anyway, back on script. I get why it's the Washington section of the Leamside Line that attracts the most fuss, but I do hope that I've made a comprehensible enough case that it's actually the Durham section that offers the most promise. I'd even gone so far as to say that even without the Washington section, there'd still be enough benefits to reopen the Durham section of the Leamside Line that we should be doing it. Needless to say, my full support very much lies behind the whole shebang of course, providing we build that feckin' housing. End of video. If you fancy, you can turn off now. But moving on to meta, off topic blah blah. Firstly, you might have noticed the part 2 inserted in the title card of this video and my constant mentioning of what I said before about the Bentham curve. In this part 1, I talked at length about Newcastle's traffic issues and how we can do a lot to fix these by bringing into use a pretty unknown 500 metre stretch of railway in Gateshead. This curve then links onto a barely used freight route which stretches right down the side of Gateshead, and it could be key to a long route to basically extend the metro right through Gateshead to Chelsea Street. If you're not seen it yet, then you know where it is if you fancy. Thanks a lot to those of you who did watch it already. I've got some subscribers, woohoo! Do not read the comments is rule number 1 of social media, but hey, I'm weak, I looked alright, and thanks a lot for your feedback there. Following up on that, my plan for this one was to try and present it in a different language to the Bentham curve one. I maybe failed in that. When we Bentham curve video, it was very much an intentional stylistic choice to lean into the vibes of speaking to a bloke at the local pub, sort of selling my credentials as a proper northern lad and speaking to you using a level and all that, but probably never did it. So with this video, I tried to shift the dial a bit more towards using my work voice rather than my pub voice. I definitely slipped sometimes, occasionally on purpose, but broadly I'm hoping I still sound proper cheesy chips and don't come across too much like some sort of hyacinth bouquet, Lord of the Manor type speaking down to the plebs. Yeah, I do still hope that everyone can understand me and the subtitles aren't necessary in this one. By the way, subtitles are available. Probably should have said that at the start. Sociolinguistics. Do I have my thoughts there, but the purpose of language is communication and trying to reach a broad audience. There's a reason you get so many YouTubers whose native language is completely unrelated to English doing their videos in English. Even though my content's intentionally super duper local, and I'd be surprised if anyone not of these parts has an interest, you never know. Why alienate them with my very manner of speaking? Best leave that to the nonsense I say. Going forth, I'll continue to try and seek the balance of keeping some character intact whilst being comprehensible to a large amount of people. I'm contemplating making a shortened and posher version of my Bencham Curve video at some point in the future, as I do think that's an important topic. Anyway, hopefully more people should have been able to watch this one without subtitles, and yeah, that's a hint there. If you do plan on going and watching the Bencham Curve video now, subtitles are available. Shortened Bencham Curve video, that's one more for the list. I'd planned to do something much shorter than the Bencham Curve video this time around, but with the Leamside Line as a currently developing story, I felt I really had to cover it, and I did my usual thing and it just bloated. I really do believe, however, that you can't look at these things in isolation and have to consider the whole context. Originally, I'd intended to get this video out before the election. The mayoral election, that is, but usual excuses here: full-time job, kids, still feeling to get an easy recording setup that I'm happy with, and so on and so forth. Oh, was me. A new one this time around though: whooping cough. Yes, in the year of our Lord 2024, that is a thing that a fully vaccinated grown adult man can get, and it sucked. It wrecked my ability to speak for months. Oh yeah, and on top of all that, I finally got around to playing Persona 5, so aye. Seems I've really been gazumped with a lot of new developments of the Leamside Line reopening, and a bit of coverage on TV about Washington's 60th anniversary. Bum. Anyway, next up on the list, as mentioned, I've got some smaller pieces to be doing, which, didn't I say that before? There's one less hyperlocal video on population density, it shouldn't take us too long, and then there's another that's just kinda about that one patch of wasteland outside Shillingham Road metro station, kinda-ish. On buses, I've got to do the bus one someday, don't I? Though I may well be getting pipped to the post by real world events there too. So, aye, thanks for watching. What's it the proper YouTubey people say? I like, subscribe, OnlyFans? What? No, I'm not doing that. Aye, let the crack be mighty. Ta-ra.